Hello everyone, good afternoon. Respected resource person of the program, Dr. Tanisha, Dr. Juri Datta, Head Department of Assamese, my dear colleagues, and the participants. First of all, I want to say a few things about our journey with digital humanities. Uh, Actually, we have started a course on DH, and in the very beginning we have received lot of support from Professor Samantak Das from Jadavpur University and Professor Ranjit Kumar Devagoswamy from our university. He was the former Shankardev Chair professor. Professor Ranjit Kumar Devagoswamy established a digital archive in our institution. And we have digitized more than 4,000 Assamese rare books and manuscripts. And we have been organizing various talks on DH. Dr. Arjun Ghosh from IIT Delhi, Moirakshi Chaudhary from IIT Jodhpur, Dr. Koel Mitra from Neosei University, West Bengal, participated in our talks, in our events. And like previous years, this year, we also organized a lecture series on DH. Uh, First lecture will be delivered by Tanisha Guin from IIT Jodhpur. Anyway, uh, first of all, uh, before Dr. Tanisha begins her lecture, I request Dr. Juri Datta to deliver the welcome remark.
Thank you.
Over
Thank you,
to
Dr. Neong. Thank you, Dr. Neong. It is our pleasure to have you among us, Dr. Tanisha. Good afternoon to one and all present here. Already, Dr. Neong has mentioned about the journey that we have started digital humanities, that introduction to digital humanities as a course in our syllabus, which is very new actually. New in the sense like in the departments here, in the Department of Assamese, in Assamese department in Assam, I believe that no one has introduced such a course. So that way, like it's a new thing, and we have gathered the courage to start it with the help of course, with the advice and the proper guidance from the people that already Dr. Neuk has mentioned. So I'm happy that we have been able to just arrange talks and sometimes some workshop kind of like deliberations by different experts from the different parts of the country. And this year we have started the talk, Digital Humanities Series, that talk of Digital Humanities Series, and it will begin today. So this is the first talk of this series, and we have with us Dr. Tanisha Guin, and she will be delivering understanding digital archiving from the global south concept and concerns. And I welcome Dr. Gun, and at the same time, I request all our participants here to, if you have any doubts or any queries, so you please talk to Madam Tanisha, and I believe that it will be a fruitful discussion at the same time, like she will be delivering the lecture and the discussion will also be there. And we are really happy to have you among us, Dr. Tanisha. I welcome, formally I say that I welcome you to deliver the lecture. I welcome you among us. Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, you're not audible. I believe you're muted.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Dr. Julie Dutta. Thank you so much. Now I want to introduce our resource person, Dr. Tanisha. Uh, Her academic interests are identity studies, popular culture, knowledge system in global south, new media studies. She has studied at EFL University Hyderabad. Her doctoral research look at mainstream Bhadralok identity formation around Barabazar, Calcutta. She is currently working on a project funded by the ICWT, the University of California, that explore the nation of a normative at the illustration in colonial Calcutta. She joined the School of Liberal Art, IIT Jodhpur, as an assistant professor in July 2022. For the last few years, she has been looking at biopolitical and ecological concerns around the Sundarban area in West Bengal, through whose stories for young adult popular beliefs, practice of ecological conservation, and lore around tigers. We are extremely happy to have her as our resource person. Anyway, without much delay, we want to start the lecture. Dr. Tanisha, you may start the lecture. Over to Dr. Tanisha.
Thank you so much, sir. And ma'am, thank you so much for the kind invitation. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you and hearing your thoughts about it. And what ma'am said regarding asking questions, please do, because we are all trying to figure out our answers. Nobody here is trained in digital humanities. We have all started studying it. And that's a very important distinction that we need to make, especially in humanities departments in India. I think you'll agree with me. Right? Now, in today's talk, I thought I will talk about three main themes. And it's good to know that Orjunda Moirakhidi, who are some of the best minds right now on digital humanities in India, have already spoken to you. Since today's talk is on digital archiving, and in Indian language disciplines, departments, language and literary studies go hand in hand. Before I start, I would like to know from you what words or how you think of when you think of the word digital archiving or archiving in general. Yes, keeping records. Since I'm talking to students from the Department of Assamese, I'm assuming that you're fairly well versed into at least some branches of Indian literary and cultural writing. That must be the focus of some of the work that you're doing in your other courses, right? Now, typically when we talk about digital humanities, you may have realized, sir, incidentally, is this getting recorded? Do we?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So you may have realized that the moment we say DH in India, there is immediately this backlash of, isn't that very elitist? Most people in India don't use internet. Most people in India don't have access to internet or technology in the way we understand them. We use words like development or progress to measure how digital a culture is. And therefore, isn't it very counter equality to talk about digital humanities in India? Only rich people or otherwise privileged people can do DH in India. And as we have been seeing in different kinds of conversations, there is no one way of using digital tools. A lot of people typically use tools, especially in infrastructure starved spaces, in increasingly creative ways. Think of the way in which WhatsApp groups, which are primarily for communication, right? Friendship, communication, socializing, they have turned into everything from fundraising because of a natural calamity like Amphan or Yas, especially during the pandemic, to business practically shop porters that are not visible on Amazon or Flipkart maybe, but are doing a very good business out of people's bedrooms and kitchens, right? So the entire idea that digital humanities is an elitist thing itself, first of all, needs to be challenged. Whether we like it or not, we live in digital cultures. Everybody in different ways uses digitality. And the moment we start talking about digital participation or digital cultures, we see that people are choosing to use it as a tool. It's in itself neither good nor bad, depending on how you use it. Using it as a tool to make up for or to make do with certain other deficits or gaps that we have. And these gaps can be in terms of infrastructure, these gaps can be in terms of education, access to particular kinds of knowledges, preservation of particular kinds of cultures, all of it. When we talk of digital archiving, it is no different. So to begin with, anybody who thinks that so many people in India do not have access to the internet, why are we still talking of digital humanities? I would request you to go into this with this attitude instead. We have this word that most Indian languages use or understand, jugaad, making do. Within digital archiving, we have seen some of the most interesting kinds of jugaad happening within the Indian context or the South Asian context, or at large, the global South context, right? To talk about some of the key themes or concerns around digital archiving, I have thought of mentioning 3 main sub-themes or topics. And I'll talk for, say, 15-20 minutes on each. And once you are done with them, the lecture is over officially. First, what is archiving? Second, what is digital archiving? And third, what does it mean to use a word like digital archiving? How is it being used in spaces like India in particular and Global South in general? What are the key concerns or themes or questions that we are beginning to see? Now, the one person who responded in the Google chat is correct. The moment we start talking about archives, there is immediately a whole host of words like record keeping, collection, repository, right? That start coming in. The moment we start talking about an archive, immediately there is the sense that some documents, objects that have value of some way or the other, otherwise we wouldn't want to preserve them, are preserved by keeping them in an official domain or space that has the sole function of preserving them. Now, preserving without making them accessible to an audience or consumer doesn't make sense. So the moment we start talking about archiving, we are not only talking about preservation, we also refer to access, which becomes a very important word. Especially because if you go back to the first or initial archives or museums or what started off museums, we would see this very curious thing called curio cabinets. I don't know if you've heard of them. The word curio means antiques, typically things that are old, things that have value, but at the same time, things that are different or weird or not very familiar to an immediate context. So the word curio also draws from curiosity, right? And typically we would have people who have the monetary and mobility resources to go around to different parts of the world or to visit markets or bazaars or agents from whom they can buy things that have been made in different parts of the world away from where they initially are. They would end up buying knickknacks, what we call showpieces, right? So the moment you go to a rich person's house, rich along caste, class, across different cultures, different words are used as relevant, you would see this cabinet which is full of things that technically do not have a lot of use value, that are there on display. That is a sign of the cultural curiosities that are there. So in one particular part of the country, people make containers out of elephant tusks and then they engrave on it. So it's a very interesting object. When you think of a typical dabba or a mason jar, you typically don't think of an object like that. In some other part of the country, people make pens out of something else. And these curio cabinets did not have any logic to them by the very nature of the word. A rich person goes somewhere, sees something, likes it, is in a position to buy it, buys it as a frivolity or a curiosity, or something that will act as a bit of a decoration or prestige marker. You have entire museums in India, like the Salarjung Museum, or if you're in Baroda, you will see the Baroda Art and Picture Gallery, which are entirely created out of the whims or likings or personal, very personal tastes and preferences of this one member of royalty, or this one person who had both the mobility and the money to buy them. So one of the stories about the Baroda Museum is that the king of Baroda would go abroad because he had arthritis or gout, because cold weather is easier for it. And every time he would go abroad, he would come back with things that he had randomly shopped. Since he had a greater purchasing power, this often meant what we would today consider antiques, right? And an entire museum is built out of it. From this very haphazard collection of objects, the focus becomes a little more pedagogical, which is to say, public information, public humanities, teaching, raising awareness, that with the emergence of public museums. Think of the shift from something like a very rich person's or otherwise eccentric person's personal collection to a government museum, and how these objects, still curios, still antiquaries, are placed in a museum with a pedagogical motive. That the general public should be able to come to the museum and know a little bit more about history or culture, what they are coming from, what are some of the things that were found locally or elsewhere, where for the first time, pedagogy starts emerging as an important word. Pedagogy, teaching, giving information, making somebody learn more about their culture or history or scientific facts. We have museums of sciences, as you know, right? And the moment you start organizing, yes, people sharing short stories, you're absolutely right. I'm going to come to that very soon. There is this very interesting word called presumption that I mean to talk about when we start talking about digital archives. So I would request you to just bear with me a little. Like, kahani abhi baki hai. Now, so the moment we start talking about archives in this way, where a group of objects are now being arranged to teach something, we are immediately narrativizing it. We may do it consciously or unconsciously. We may have different kinds of ideologies that we refer to, but we are immediately creating a story or a linear narrative out of it. That is supported by these objects or these documents or these texts that you see. And the moment we start doing that, the moment we start saying that there is a learning value or a pedagogical value above and beyond the craftsmanship or the economic value of an object, this understanding of value expands into what we cannot call anything but power relations. And when I say power relations, I don't just mean top-down bodies like, say, the government or the military. Typical associations of what is prestigious, what can be cultural capital, what has value, what is worth preserving, immediately becomes this huge question. For instance, I'm sure that if I turn to you and say, oh, you know, I find Gutkha ads very interesting. I think somebody should create an outfit. Most of you will turn around and look at me strangely, because Gutkha ads are neither valuable because they are old, nor are they valuable because they have a particular kind of aesthetics or sophistication, nor are they valuable in terms of the product that they are trying to sell. Most of us would consider tobacco, chewing tobacco, harmful, and the habit nasty. We don't consider it culturally very refined or sophisticated. And it's in fact a huge social evil. So why would you even try to conserve something like that? Does it really have value? Right? The moment we start talking about this question of values, immediately a huge question of what is culturally preservable, what does not have value, what should be ignored, become these huge questions. I'll give you a very easy example. Ohomia and Bangla, Oriya, Bihar, as you know, we have a colonial trajectory that feeds into each other. We have had a lot of cross-pollinations. And in Bangla, we once had a very horrific genocide known as the Maricchapi massacre. Those of you who are familiar with the writings of Amitabh Ghosh may be familiar with the word. Till date, for whatsoever reasons, the Maricchapi massacre has minimal to no digital footprint. Not because there isn't enough information out there, or people who experienced it, or people's family members who experienced it out there. Not because it is not actually a physical material space, as opposed to something a lot more ephemeral or ambiguous, right? But because for whatsoever reasons, knowledge about it, information about it was not made public. And it doesn't matter that we are not in that political situation anymore, whether that political party or that government has big roles to play or not, doesn't matter. The digital footprint continues to be practically negligible, right? So the moment we talk about value, the moment we talk about something being preserved because it has value, and the value can be anything. For a comic book reader, the first edition copies of particular comic books have tremendous value. Whereas for somebody else, it might look like something very trivial or popular or unnecessary, right? But the moment we start talking about it in terms of value, the question of access immediately starts coming in. In other words, you can't talk about a politics of archiving, how to create an archive, what constitutes an archive, without talking about the politics of representation. Ideally, even though information, knowledge, these are supposed to be public resources, there are typically very few attempts of gatekeeping them. In practice, certain kinds of knowledge are more visible than certain other kinds of knowledge. Certain forms are taken more seriously than certain other forms of knowledge. A very easy example is, especially for Indian language and literary studies, the distinction between oral and written works. You know that the moment, there is technically speaking nothing hierarchical. There are some societies which are more oral. And in some societies, the written letter came a lot later. And sometimes it is literally an act of borrowing from other societies or ethnic groups. But the moment you start talking about a very colonial modern sense of knowledge, the written word immediately gains a lot more emphasis, seriousness, formality, standardization, value than the oral speech. In fact, we still talk about the gaps in representation of oral histories or oral performances that have been turned into written texts, and then these written texts are getting increasingly standardized, losing a lot of local variety or local color, richness, diversity. And in the process, making communities, populations, groups who created these texts a little more marginalized, right? I hope whatever I have said so far makes sense for you. You can relate with this in terms of a particular example you have in mind, or something that you have studied, or something that you have seen in your ordinary everyday life, right? Now, the important thing there being value and knowledge, if these are the two words that we are playing with when we talk about access, one of the first things that we need to remember for archives, therefore, is this attempt of narrativizing everything. It's not just enough to have a great king's ink bottle or pen or a document that they had signed, a certificate that they had written, but also to understand, to tell you something about that king. Was it a good king? Was it a bad king? Was he evil? Did he have an amazing love story? In other words, unless you get an emotional response that helps you attach value to these objects or documents, an archive doesn't make sense, right? The second question that becomes very important is, when we actually start putting an archive together, often we see the opposite of something like this linearity or this narrative happening. Archaeology or genealogy, whether you're familiar with the works of Michel Foucault or not, they don't rely on this neat narrative. When you're in an archaeological site as a historian, there is no guarantee that you will actually find the feeding bottle a person used versus when he grew up, he or she grew up and used something else, versus when they grew older, they used something else. You don't. It's a matter of accident, coincidence, right? So on one hand, the moment you are starting to talk about an archive, whether about a particular place, a particular person, a particular event, or any other kind of performance, bodies of knowledge, whatever you might go to, the actual material object or document or any other cultural artifact, like the recording of somebody's speech, that is kept in an archive is often a matter of accident. We have no clue about why that piece survived while a lot of other things did not. We can't rely on this very neat string of a narrative, a grand narrative, or a story, as we say it, that will be obvious or possible on the basis of these objects that we have managed to unearth. And yet, despite that accidental nature of it or the contingent nature of it, there is this overarching emphasis on narrativizing them. This is another way where the question of value, knowledge, politics of representation come in very strongly. Michel Foucault, you're welcome to go look him up, came up with these words, archaeology, genealogy, as opposed to history. And he was not just talking about the actual act of history writing or the actual act of archaeology. He said any cultural event, any cultural artifact, any kind of knowledge system is more of a genealogical one or an archaeological one, where there is no clear coherence between the objects or events that you might find out, rather than this very neat, grand narrative that history typically creates about it. And he wanted people to be very aware of the gap between this grand narrative of history and the accidents, contingents, often occlusions, things people forget about, or a very random, trivial thing that nobody in an actual lived society would take seriously, but on hindsight is one of the biggest things that people have managed to conserve or preserve, and therefore is the biggest link to understanding a particular social situation or culture is, right? This is one of the reasons why Foucault reinforce which knowledges you take seriously. The knowledges, in turn, reinforce these power relations. And this is true of any kind of narrative, history writing, archival practice, if you think about it. It doesn't, even minority or often subaltern archives rely on this, because that is how representation works, right? So I told you a little about the ways in which we understand the word value, how it is connected to this understanding of the word knowledge, and how archives within themselves have this contradiction where on one hand, you have a collection of objects or documents that may or may not conform to a neat narrative. On the other hand, you use those very objects as the primary evidence on the basis of which you create a grand narrative that is very linear, very coherent, that has an element of cause and effect, what we call causality. And that makes a very neat, coherent statement or description without any contradictions or without any sub-themes or mutually contradicting or resisting elements. Real life, as we know, is a little more complex than that. And presumably the real life or the real living conditions or circumstances that we are trying to archive, whether through literary texts or otherwise, falls within that logic. This is why one of the key texts that anyone who's interested in archiving is taught, it's by Jacques Derrida. I hope the name is familiar, and it's called Archive Fever. And there Derrida talks about how archive refers to both the authority of who is saying this is knowledge or this is information, as opposed to rumor or gossip, as well as that knowledge itself. So what that knowledge is as important as how that knowledge is being governed, authorized, edited, presented, held back, sometimes occluded. And both these acts are very key to the act of archiving. Archiving or an archive is not just the material that you're archiving, but also how you're presenting it, how you're cataloging it, creating the metadata of it, as some people would say, right? How you're choosing to create these catalogs and what language you're using for the representation of it. These are some of the crucial or primary concerns that we have in any archive. In current lived situations, if you look at the way in which tribal museums, for instance, have come forward very strongly, or digitally, I don't know if you're aware of the work of P. Sainath, where PARI, People's Archive of Rural India, think of the kind of stories that they're bringing forward. There is always an ideology at work, there is always a power knowledge at work, and you're either resisting it or conforming with it or negotiating with it in one way or the other. But whatever it is, you are responding to it. It is a normative relation. You're not working outside it in this very objective, neutral representation of something. An objective or neutral representation, in other words, is very difficult to achieve, if at all. Right? How does digitality change this? When I walk in to talk about digital humanities with my students, I talk about three things that, as cultural studies people, we are not programmers, we are not people who write codes or create web platforms. We look at how socio-cultural interactions, relations are playing out, right? From that perspective, we see that digitality has typically three elements to it. And this is my version of it. You are welcome to agree or disagree. I look forward to see how you make sense of it. One, there are things that already exist in culture, in society, in social frameworks, and that have a continuum in digitality. A very easy example is the concept of friendship or dating, for instance. We have always had these understandings of creating relationships with people who are not our immediate. What friendship, dating, they highlight that people are not necessarily related to you end up being emotionally close to you. We have always had that idea, but social media has, of course, changed or extended it in some ways, where being Facebook friends means a certain thing. Sharing somebody's hashtag means a particular sense of solidarity. You may not agree with them or you may not be aware of what their lives are like in any other aspect, but using that one hashtag is that one point of commonality that you have found, right? Another very easy example in the South Asian context is, of course, matchmaking. In any conventional society, if you trace back the histories, you will see that different societies have different very formal or informal ways of matchmaking. There are matchmaking institutes, certain occupations or certain people are designated matchmakers in a society where their job is to find eligible people from different families that would sync with each other, right? And propose them. Think of the way in which Shaadi.com works nowadays. And we have these increasingly specialized variations of Telugu matrimony, which is a subpart of Bharat matrimony, or IIM matrimony, which is a subpart of, again, this understanding of a South Asian or Bharat matrimony, or NRI matrimony. All these which are continuing with the same tasks and functions that traditional matchmakers had, but of course doing them digitally. And both the act is not staying the same, And neither the social interactions there are staying the same. It's a two-way street. Both are affecting, changing each other in some way, right? That's one thing. There are things that are specific to the digital. When we talk about words like cybernetics, for instance, one of the definitions of cybernetics, seeing how machines work and understanding that to understand how human beings and social institutions work. So instead of trying to understand how machines work in terms of humans, we are doing it the other way around. Or you have words like cyborg, which are, if you're familiar with Donna Haraway or if there are any fans of science fiction or not, you know that they are part human, part machine. Bucky Barnes from Captain America, the Marvel Universe, is a cyborg because he has that arm, right? Where it's very difficult to distinguish between where the robotic or the machinery aspect of it stops and the human aspect of things begin. There is the third way in which we use the digital, where we think of the digital as a tool. When we talk about things like text mining, data scraping, web harvesting, everyone has heard the word big data or data science or data analytics in some way or the other. These are very good examples of using the digital as a tool to reach certain other goals or motivations or objectives that you may have, right? How does all of this affect archiving? One of the biggest things that digitality has done is that it has created this point of access. When we look at the cultural history of the world, we have always had a sense of certain knowledges being available to certain people. Think of the curio cabinets themselves. You need to have a particular amount of economic resources to be able to achieve it, to be able to afford them, right? And not everyone will be allowed in a very rich person's house to just see these objects. Only their friends or people they trust will be. In other words, there has always stayed this gap between what the common person or the ordinary person or the person who does not have a lot of resources is allowed to access in terms of cultural knowledge. It can even be entertainment. But whether it's religious knowledge, whether it's secular knowledge, scientific knowledge, linguistic knowledge. Remember how in Mritshakatikam, we see practices of certain people speaking in Sanskrit while certain other people speaking in Pali or Prakrit. And that is supposed to reflect real social conditions, right? So one of the first things that digitality offers in terms of archiving is reducing this element of gatekeeping, promoting access. And this access can be promoted in a number of ways. Everyone here has presumably heard of Project Gutenberg. Project Gutenberg is the website, the online archive, where people find freely accessible, freely downloadable files of literary texts, literary, historical, geographical, any kind of text that is in the public domain. That is to say, that is free of copyright. Even as I talk about Project Gutenberg, it is very, very crucial to mention, especially in a room full of academics, how we have illicit or illegal archives like torrent. All of us has downloaded or borrowed a book, a file, a PDF file from somebody else who has downloaded at least one file from sites like LibGen or torrent. If you tell me you haven't, I will not believe you. And these are archives where we do the same thing. There are the same concerns of access, of visibility, of availability, irrespective of location. And there are a huge set of debates around copyright and copyleft people, where there are discussions around authorship versus ownership. If a book costs 20,000 rupees in Indian currency, even if it's an elite institution that has a fund for its library, can it really afford that book? Does it make sense, therefore, for students to download it? There are cases like the famous Delhi University case. I don't know if you're aware of it, where the Indian government, the Indian High Court, and then Supreme Court held that as long as something is being used for educational purposes, photocopying it, pirating it, not respecting the media ownership laws or intellectual property laws is valid. In India, the medtech industry, the pharmaceuticals industry, is famous for reverse engineering, and the Indian government endorses it, because the entire point of reverse engineering is to see something that has been patented in some part of the global north and to recreate it. Reverse engineering, literally taking its components apart, seeing how it is working and creating it backwards, as it were, and then making it available a lot more affordably within a local context, right? So the moment we start talking about access and this new sense of digital access, we have both licit and illicit archives. We have huge debates around what does it mean to have that. Remember Derrida's words on authority or originality, authorship, ownership debates, and how they continue to change around this question of who gets to have access to which knowledge and why will you trust it. Think of the paradox that Wikipedia creates, where on one hand, the moment we need to know something, we immediately go to Wikipedia to just find out what it is. We trust it. Googling and wikiing have become the two big words to find information. But most of us will agree that citing Wikipedia in an academic essay or article is not a sign of good authorship. A good scholar will not cite Wikipedia. They will go to other sources, because Wikipedia has an authorship issue. It's crowdfunded, crowdsourced, right? These are some of the key concerns that continue to inform digital archiving. The second concern outside this question of access and authorship that is there very much the moment we talk about digital spaces is this very interesting word that is possible only in digitality, and that is presumption. Excuse me. The word presumption is a coinage that brings together production and consumption. And digitality is one of the first spaces, or new media as we today understand it, is one of the first domains where we have seen a situation where, whether it is knowledge or any other kind of cultural artifact or performance, whether it's theatrical, whether it's an actual object, whether it's the image of an object, it's not a top-down structure. It is a lot more participatory. What do I mean by that? Think of the way in which you open social media accounts, where on one hand, you're submitting to the terms and conditions of the site, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram, whether it's Twitter, you're surrendering certain aspects of your privacy, personal knowledge of yourself that you may not want to share with strangers otherwise. But in the very act of creating that social media account, you're expressing yourself. You're also expressing your subjectivity or your own agency. Think of the way in which it doesn't even have to happen in terms of institutions like Meta and Mark Zuckerberg. Think of the way in which the selfie culture works. On one hand, you're taking a selfie to match a trend. Other people are normatively taking selfies. You want to join that crowd. In some sense, you're losing your sense of originality because you're submitting to something that a bigger group of people are doing. On the other hand, the very act of taking that selfie, including the angle, the smile, the pose, the one out of the 15 selfies you took that you're going to post on social media, through all of that, you are expressing yourself. It is a very individual iteration in the very act of being very public. So how does this affect the question of archiving? In one sense, you have archives at a huge spectrum of scales. Think of the way in which, because Meta or Facebook has been around long enough, now it has started giving you options like memorializing somebody, which is to say, if somebody who was a Facebook or Meta user has passed away, Facebook will freeze that person's social posts, photographs, thoughts, opinions, conversations, sometimes fights, debates, everything almost like it's an online repository where you go and read them, see them, and you remember the person or you grieve for that person. Think of the way in which online journalism, from the most formal ones with, say, the Times of India or Anand Bazar, ABP Limited, making posts around the pandemic, to the most informal ones like the WhatsApp shares that people went around with, end up creating archives of very difficult to document situations like the pandemic. How we literally, some of us are going back to them, reading them, trying to make sense of them, to understand the complexity of the pandemic and what it meant in the Indian situation. I am writing a paper about how someone who you typically will not see in mainstream representations a lot, somebody who is very poor, very marginal, a child from a tribal indigenous community in India, because of the act of her death, managed to gain a certain digital footprint that she would never have gained in her life, presumably. And what does it mean to track digital footprints and archives in that situation? What Dr. Jury has pointed out, Facebook groups for writers, people sharing short stories, novels within these groups, can, in this understanding, I think you will agree, be definitely used as a part of understanding particular kinds of archives which are relying on this element of presumption. Production in the very act of consumption. Consumption of the site, the platform. Production that is a little more individual, a little more unique, a little more specific. Think of the number of YouTube videos that we have of people trying to cook things, where you don't have to be that one particular channel in DD National that shows whatever it is going to show, and whatever is getting broadcasted is the only thing that people are going to consume. Because of digitality in the domains of entertainment, not necessarily formally in the form of education alone, the idea of where knowledge can be found, what are the possible archives of something, have gone through a massive change. And this element of presumption therefore becomes very important when we keep these things in mind. Especially because in the Indian context, the moment we start talking about archiving, museums, the National Culture Fund, museum digitizations, these are the typical spaces or the typical domains where we start talking about archives. There is somebody called Jayati Bose who has written a very interesting article on museum collections in India, where she talks about the museum reform points and how they helped in bringing digital archiving in the Indian context. And for the longest time, the struggle that Indian museums and other public archives have had, that despite their very public nature, the fact that they are institutions of public humanities, they somehow feel that there is a sense of alienation or distance from the common person. They are somehow not being able to reach their target audience or their target consumer. They are not becoming sites of public humanities. They are still a domain of specialists and dusty old cases which are sort of being preserved or often ignored, destroyed accidentally, because there isn't enough engagement, enough attention being given to them. I will finish this by mentioning this one final word, and that is popular. You may have noticed how we started with a discussion on value and knowledge and how that is changing or shifting, or how that can be very accidental or incidental. But across any kind of literary or other forms of cultural artifacts, the moment we try to put them in a catalog, we start hierarchizing them. We see words like margi and deshi, for instance, right? Or mainstream and marginal. Or depending on the context, Sanskrit literature versus other Indian literatures. Think of the way in which you're all studying an Indian language and literature. Think of the way in which there have been huge debates around words like vernacular versus regional. And these are not useless debates. These words have weight. They have certain meanings. We are all existing in post-colonial societies. There are particular attentions, particular attitudes around any knowledge that continue to govern all our understanding of what knowledge is preservable. Think of the way in which I'm assuming you have done at least one Indian literature course. The kind of fiction that Mahashweta Devi has, where she's deliberately pointing towards what Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak would call the subaltern. Because there is an absence of representation or a very stereotyping of the representation of certain kinds of people, right? The word popular both helps and has the potential to complicate this discussion. If you understand the word popular in the way people like Stuart Hall have defined it, where they have said that the popular is the site of both dominance and resistance, you will see that a lot of digital cultures, a lot of digital archives, a lot of what I'm calling presumption, a lot of what are continuums of formal archives in the form of, say, the digital print of a classical Madhubani religious painting that somebody's just randomly wearing as a t-shirt and is having non-vegetarian food or breaking other kinds of religious taboos around, right? The word popular becomes very important because across different kinds of examples, something can both conform to certain existing hierarchies of knowledge systems, even as they disrupt it. And that is something that, as people who are interested in digital archiving and the importance of archiving in the first place, of why we need to preserve certain things, should everything be equally preserved in these questions, especially from the global south, we need to ask. Because the risk of stereotyping or the danger of what somebody like Adichie would call a single story is something that we are all resisting in post-colonial academia, in literary studies, in cultural studies, from whichever direction we try to ask this question. The question of representation, the politics of representation, and therefore the politics of archiving becomes very crucial for us. And digitality has become a game changer. Whether you like it or hate it, whether you criticize it or you think it is useful, it has some value in certain ways. It is something that we can't ignore when we are talking about these questions. I think it's 4:25 now, so I will stop here and hear questions, comments, concerns. If you disagree with me, please tell me. I would like to know why you are disagreeing. It's important.
Any question? Any comment?
The only bad
Hello,
question
ma'am.
is the one you are not going to ask.
There is
Am I
one.
Yes,
audible?
yes, yes, Devashish. Please go ahead.
I am Devashish Buranghai, ma'am, a PhD research scholar from the department.
Mhm.
I am keeping you to. Thank you for your insightful lecture. I wanted to actually know a little bit more about influence of copyright laws and intellectual property rights on digital archiving initiatives.
I'm glad that you raised that question, Devashish. Copyright and intellectual property laws, as you know, have gone through a very big and decisive change increasingly, both because of social media on one hand and the very illicit access points on the other hand. Think of the way in which different governments have increasingly made stricter laws about what we call media piracy, where you consume, own a piece of media material without paying the full price for it, or sometimes any price for it, right? But in the global south, we have also seen this as a mark of extreme creativity and agency. I don't know if you are familiar with films like Malegaon Ka Superman. Malegaon is this very low-income handloom factory town that has a lot of different kinds of issues. It is not remarkable or special, except that it has a tiny film crew which makes local versions of Malegaon Ka Superman, Malegaon Ka Sholay, Malegaon Ka, there's a whole indigenous film industry there. And that immediately draws attention to the fact that consumers are not just passive recipients of knowledge. Consumers are participants of knowledge. The moment we talk about questions of access, there is immediately this top-down hierarchical structure of I'm going to give you information or culture and you will through the process get sophisticated. There are words like the banking model that Paulo Freire uses, for instance, to talk about it, right? In the face of this, there is this huge debate about authorship, ownership. If somebody from Malegaon cannot afford to go to a multiplex and watch a film on Superman or Batman, is DC actually losing any money if they are making their own variations of it, or all the cheap t-shirts that you get to see of it, knockoffs as we call them? So that is one direction where the debate is going. The other direction is, of course, what is made up in the digital archives themselves. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the School of Cultural Texts and Records in Jadavpur University have managed to digitize everything that Rabindranath Tagore has written. And they are available in this free website endorsed by the government of India called Bichitra. And that is amazing. You shouldn't have to be able to afford that. The entire idea is that the moment you have a data pack, a net pack, you can go and read anything you feel like in it. But that begs the question that digitizing Tagore was a very easy question to answer, because both Tagore is one of the most well-known scholars, polymaths, authors, poets, singers, composers in India. And secondly, Tagore was very safely in the public domain. There was no copyright on Tagore's material held by the Vishwabharati or the other organizations in Shantiniketan that were enforceable when Jadavpur was doing this. The fact that the government supported this venture helped. The moment we start talking about what goes in an archive, we have crucial questions around how should we access something. If making access to it free is going to harm the community or the actual author of it, is archiving becoming a helpful task, or is it falling back into very regressive relations? These are very important questions to ask. Does that answer your question to some extent?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
It's my pleasure. Is this helpful? I don't know what else you're studying. Is this resonating with some of the questions or concerns that you might have had? Whether it's a paper you're writing or a syllabus text that you're reading somewhere else or something that you want to do in your PhD, is this aligning with something, some of those discussions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I'm
because
glad.
I am.
Yes, please go ahead.
Actually, I am trying to analyze some Assamese novel through digital tools, and for that matter, I have to do the Unicode version of each text. That's why I raised that question, because most of the books are they are still under the section of copyrighted works.
Yes. If you have already heard from Ojuda, you must be aware of the work he's doing on OCR based. Everyone is familiar with Unicode, OCR, these words, hopefully.
Yes, ma'am.
And that is one of the biggest points of contention or discussion that he also has. Or in a very different direction, where copyright or authorship is not enforced in the exact same way. If you go and look up the People's Archive of Rural India, and the entire point of making it open access, it has no financial or any other kind of gatekeeping going on. It is trying to be as multilingual as possible. How do you understand questions of authorship linked to knowledge in that context? That might help.
Thank you, ma'am.
Any other questions? I can't tell if
Dr.
yes,
Judy B. Soikia, Dr. Judy B. Soikia, she is actively participating.
okay.
Dr. Judy B. Soikia.
Yes, sir.
Is there any comment?
No, sir, I'm just being part of the IPR cell of Tejpur University. I was very much interested on what ma'am is going to deliberate upon, because we are also trying to digitally archive many of our things of university in a process of actually carving out our digital policy, copyright policy. So I would just like to hear from you, like as we are moving towards digitizing more of the literary works, as you mentioned about the archiving process, but then also we are open to so much of infringement, though we are not taking into account about the authorship, but there will be instances, more of instances where we will see more of plagiarism happening in some way or the other. So I just hope that we will be able to trace out the real authors in the way of making it public, and in future we will be able to point out if there is some sort of similarity in ideation, not because we have copyright on expressions, but if there's similarity, we should be able to make it more visible. I would like to learn from you what IIT Jodhpur actually does in doing about their own digital policy, digital archiving policy, if you have any sort of that kind of thing.
We are only beginning to have the discussion. I think somebody needs to be muted, otherwise it will echo. Thank you so much, Dr. Judy. That is a very important question that we are all struggling with, especially because if you notice in the humanities, we all have a sort of social inequity concern that we are trying to focus towards, right? We are trying to bring forward things that are not visible enough or that need to be talked about. And the very act of making it accessible digitally, on one hand, improves the visibility. It's like you have a bigger stake, you're reclaiming something of the ownership. In the very act, of course, getting financial rewards or royalty becomes a big problem. In all of this, I think IIT is part of the broader system of NPTEL, as you must be aware. And not just IIT, but MIT, for instance, has been doing open courseware increasingly, both before the pandemic, but of course, since then, a number of things are being organized digitally. And the way in which we believe these kinds of academies are run, where we have what is an unspoken understanding of what some people would call a Creative Commons license, where if you upload material, if you upload a lecture, there is an increasing emphasis on making academic material as open access as possible. But open access does not mean a loss of authorship rights. You're allowed to acknowledge yourself as the author or the owner of the material. If anyone is using it, they have to acknowledge you as the source point or the person who has brought that together. But having said that, both because of institutional support or because of your own personal discretions, you're not monetizing it or making profits out of it. You will have noticed how a lot of the NPTEL courses or Gyan courses are just available as YouTube videos. Often, that the entire set is available with 40 lectures or so. And they are often citing material both in the slideshows and in the reading packets that are shared that is technically speaking within the domain of copyright. So the fair use policy for educational purposes is the one text from the Indian government that I think bears a lot of weight, especially since NEP 2020, that we all need to consider and maximize or optimize to our needs. I recently convened a faculty development program on digital humanities at a very introductory level. And all the lectures have been made open access and published in the IIT Jodhpur YouTube channel. Notice how we are not creating a particular domain or a more academic sounding title or anything like that. They are just available as IIT Jodhpur's YouTube videos. So while there are participants who registered and took course and finished the exercises and certificates, the teaching material that we all use, that we all talked in, is public. And that is one way in which we are trying to navigate these situations, I suppose. Does that help?
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, it helps.
Any question? Pathajit Bora? Any comment?
Okay. If you're not comfortable talking to me here for whatsoever reasons, you're welcome to write to me on my email ID. Dr. Nyog has it. So Sir will share it with me.
Most probably. No question. Okay then. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I have to conclude the session. There is no any question. Is there any question? No.
Oh, there's a question from Noyandeep, I think.
Noyandeep Saikia. Kindly address the question.
Nandeep, what you're asking is a very important question. It's one of the most fundamental concerns in digital humanities. So when we say, is digital humanities elitist, is it exclusionary? This is a very direct part of it. I come from the domain of cultural studies. So as far as I am concerned, this distinction that a lot of people have between high culture and low culture, where high culture has to do with heritage, preservation, classical music, and low culture is Nautankis, Bollywood music, as an example. That mass culture or culture that you do not need a particular sense of sophistication or refinement to consume. This distinction is a very false distinction and it needs to be problematized. At least that's how the scholars from my discipline, people like Raymond Williams or Stuart Hall, have talked about it. And this, in the Indian context, extends to the bhashas, the Indian languages, where beyond calling them secondary or tertiary and therefore creating a sort of hierarchy of what is the most important and then second or third or fifth rank, it's very important to bring forward the literary and cultural artifacts that are marginalized or often occluded. So I would say yes. One of the students working under me right now is working on a project on a language from Chhattisgarh that she's from Chhattisgarh, so she's very familiar with, that is used but is not treated respectfully, does not have a script. No, it's almost like Bhojpuri. It's not respectable enough to talk in that language. It's not illegal, but not respectable. And what does it mean that we are increasingly losing that language, and why do we need to preserve it? So as far as I am concerned, I would think it is very important. And whether it's archiving audio and video contents from platforms like YouTube, crowdsourcing an archive, or going to particular locations and creating more formal interviews or material in that way, both can play a very crucial and necessary role. That would be my response to it.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Noyandeep? I'm good.
Okay then. Thank you so much, madam. Thank you so much for your thought-provoking and insightful
You're a lot more senior than me. Please call me Tonisha.
Thank you so much. Thank you all the participants, and on behalf of Department of Assamese, I once again convey my heartfelt gratitude and thanks to Dr. Tanisha Madam. And I trust in our future endeavor, we will get support from your end.
Absolutely.
With this note, I conclude the program. Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Thank you, Madam.